When I start producing, I don't really have like a standard kind of thing that I'd always use to get the creative juices flowing. I never had that exact moment on that, like that special moment where everybody's always talking about like, wow, this is the melody that I'm gonna use for my next track. I actually never had that kind of moment. I just went into the studio and actually see what happened. No plan, no idea. Just went into the studio and see what happened that day. Sometimes something worked out, sometimes it really didn't. But there wasn't really a creative process to me. It was just going in and see what happens. And it still really is a little blurry to me, as in where all the creativity came from. Sometimes, of course, you do have the feeling like, hey, I have a lot of creativity right now, so I need to go into the studio. But where it came from, that actually has never been clear to me. That's still a big question mark in my life, and still is, because I still need to figure out how to trigger the creativity in myself. Because it could be really useful if you're able to trigger the creativity. Because if you're able to trigger it, you can always tell yourself when you go into the studio, and you can maximize your time and ultimately make use of the time that you spend in the studio. I've spent a lot of hours in the studio just looking at my screen and nothing happened at that moment, and that's just a waste of time in my opinion, because I didn't make any beats at the time. I was just looking at my screen and waiting for things to happen. And looking back now, I think I could have done a lot of things differently, but at that moment I didn't know how to change it or whatsoever. So I don't think there was a creative process that I really used. I just started making music, and I see what happened that day, and I see where I would end in after, like, so let's say 5 hours. So it's really different to me, but to me that was the best way to work, and that's the way I always worked. I actually never came up with any ideas from scratch. I just started working in the studio, like I said, but what really worked for me is when I just grabbed a vocal or a melody from another track. So let's say you find an a cappella on a website or whatsoever, and I just dropped it in Logic. And I started working around the vocal or around the melody that I already had, because then you can create your own interpretation of the track. And as soon as I had the beats and the bass line and the melody and all those other things, then I just erased the vocal that I used to create it, and then the things that were left over were things that you've created yourself. So that's an original, and that's the way I always like to work, because then you had like a starting point. You already had something to work with, because I really struggled with beginning a track because I wasn't really musically schooled or whatsoever. I didn't know how to play the piano. I didn't know how to play guitar or whatsoever. So to me it was really hard to start new projects, especially when it was about an original track. So I always like to work with a starting point. So I just borrowed a vocal or a melody from another track, started working around it, and as soon as I noticed like, hey, I have enough ammo to continue working on my own, then I just deleted the vocal or the other parts that I took, and I started working on my own parts. So that was the best way for me to work, and that helped me a lot in my career. Sometimes it ended up being a bootleg, and sometimes I just threw away the other parts and I left an original. To me, music is something that's really emotional, as in I really connect music with moments in life. For instance, I still know a moment where I played a track from Axwell on Creamfields, which really gave me the shivers when I played it there. And somehow it just made the connection in my brains that when I hear that track, I get the same emotion and the same feeling that I had at that moment. So to me, music is really emotion, and I think it always is useful, and it adds value in a moment. So let's say when you're watching a film, a movie, and there's a particular scene that is really sad or whatsoever, and you watch it without any music, it's not as strong than when you add a music underneath it that will support the feeling, and that will support the emotion of it. So to me, music is emotion, but I think everyone experiences it in its own way, and everyone interprets it, and I think everyone feels different about it. So to me it's emotion, but I think everyone has his own opinion and his own thing about how they live it. So to me it's emotion, and I really connected with particular moments in my life. I actually don't think I do anything differently than any other producers out there. I don't use any other software that other people don't use. I don't use any hardware that other people don't use. I think it's just a matter of being creative with the things that you have and the things that you get as a producer. You should be lucky because now we live in 2017 and a lot of stuff is for free on the internet, and if it's not for free, it's probably pretty cheap. So it's really doable to get started with music production. And back in the days, like 10 years back, 6 years back, when I started making music, it already was a bit easier, but it still was a bit harder because there weren't so many blogs and there weren't so many YouTube videos or tutorials or whatsoever. I had my nephew who always explained to me how things worked at that time. So that was my kind of YouTube tutorial at the moment. But I think I never did anything differently than any other producer. I just used a simple computer. I bought a simple MIDI keyboard at that time, like 50 euros. I bought cheap speakers, monitor speakers from Behringer, and I just started, And when I had a problem or when I couldn't continue because I didn't know how to fix it, I just called my nephew, and he would explain to me how I could fix it so I could continue. So as far as it comes down to hardware, I didn't have anything that was that special. And even at the end of my career, maybe I bought like one universal audio card, but I ended up selling it because I didn't use it that much. But that's actually that's the only thing that I bought. The rest was just software plugins. So Silent, Nexus, Massive, Battery I used a lot. So just casual plugins, casual preset banks, casual sound banks, and that's the thing that I always worked with. I think it's all about the creativity behind it and how you use those products. When you talk about being inspired by a track or just simply copying it, well, to me there's like a really thin line in between, because sometimes you hear a track that is inspired by, and you clearly hear that it's the same track or that it's the same melody or whatsoever. So to me, if I borrowed someone else's vocal or if I borrowed someone else's melody to get my creative juices going and to get my project started, I always kept in mind that I really needed to delete all the parts that I borrowed from someone else, because otherwise it's just simply copying. And that's the thing that you should really be careful of, as in you really need to cut out all the things that you borrow, because otherwise it's just simply copying. And I don't like copying. I don't think it's a good thing. You should be creative yourself. There's a lot of things you can use to be creative nowadays, so why shouldn't you be? Of course it's the easy way to copy someone, but I really don't think that's the best way to start, especially when you're a young producer. I do think it's important to follow trends, because you always have to listen to what the market wants, unless you really like to produce a completely different style or whatsoever. That's not a problem at all. But if you want to be in a commercial kind of music, or if you want to be like in the club scene, you really need to keep an eye on what's working at that moment, and you really need to change things in your own sound to pull it more to the sound that the market wants at that moment. So really be aware of the fact that you're not going to copy anyone, but getting inspired by someone or using some things and afterwards you just delete it, that's not a bad thing in my opinion. During my career, I started off building my own sound banks pretty quickly actually, and that's probably because I got a tip at a very young age from someone to start doing it. I actually never thought about it that way, because I just wanted to make music and I downloaded all the sound banks and all the sample packs, but I never thought about creating my own sound banks. But after a while I just started doing it. I just downloaded several sound banks and collected all the samples from it that I really liked, and I started building around it, and I started like layering them and creating my own track, my own sounds out of 3 other sounds. And when I've created a track or a sound that I really liked, I just saved it in my own folder, my sample folder, and in that folder was like a kick folder, a snare folder, hi-hat folder, an FX folder, all those kind of things just separately. And then I just saved them there. So when I started a new project, it was really easy for me to open that folder, and I knew that all the samples that were in there were already processed, were already approved, as in I know that they sounded well in clubs or on the radio or whatsoever. So it was a really quick way for me to work and to put out the beat so that I could continue working on the melody and on the creative part of the track. So I was there really quick with I was really quick with creating my own sound bank, and I can really recommend it to anyone to start as soon as possible. I think your music is good enough when you are happy with it, and I think that like this is one of the most asked questions on my site or on my Facebook page or whatsoever. A lot of people struggle with the idea that they don't know when a track is good enough or when the track is finished, but it really, in the end, it's just all up to you. You know, you can get feedback from everyone around you, you can get feedback from professionals, but you are the only one that is going to decide that when you're happy with the track and when you think it's finished. The only thing that you should keep in mind is that you need to have finished tracks to become an artist. So you need to pick a moment where you say like, okay, the sound is good enough, the creative process is good enough, the melody is good enough, the vocal is good enough, the track is finished, and I'm just going to put it out there, because I promise you, every week later after release, you will always look back at the track and think, oh, maybe I could have changed the hi-hats, maybe I could have changed the bass line, or maybe I could have made that melody better. You can always make it better, but the thing is, you should decide, you should pick one moment where you say like, okay, now it's good enough, and now I'm gonna release it, because otherwise you will never finish any tracks. And not finishing any tracks means not releasing any tracks. And not releasing any tracks means no gigs, no being an artist at all. So really be picky on it and just say to yourself, this is the moment where it's finished and I'm gonna release it.